for disability right. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Our next speaker is Dr. Jack Frisch, who Donna's already half introduced. But Jack came out of retirement to work on economics of disability at Griffith. Previously, he lectured in economics at the University of New South Wales, following a number of years in finance and consulting. His interest in disability stems from being father to 3 daughters, one of whom has a physical disability. For a number of years, he was also involved in disability advocacy through the Physical Disability Council of New South Wales. And Jack's going to teach us all about economics. And there'll be a multiple choice test at the end.
Thanks, Donna and Leslie. This is... Okay, first of all, as I'll just introduce myself a little bit. I'm probably a philosopher, economist, observer, rather than anything else. That means I observed life rather than observe economics passionately, rather than sort of advocate. And, you know, Donna sort of said, don't trust economists. There's a difference between economists, good economists, and economists who make money out of economics, especially in consulting and banking, etc. Okay, and even in universities. I'm retired, so now I can say whatever I want. But while you're at the university, unfortunately, you've got to play ball. You've got to get referees to agree within the paradigm, etc. So one of the things what I'll show you is how good economics is different from bad economics. And in particular, how economics is different from finance. Very, very important point. Because everyone gets that mixed up. The journalists, the media gets it mixed up, and economists sometimes get mixed up, especially if they get to be paid by finance companies, etc. So I'll outline a bit of that. But before doing that, there's 3 types of... I've got 3 messages here. One is to policy advisors and people in government. And that is to read chapter 20 very carefully, okay? And to understand chapter 20, because I think you do need economics. It's a hard chapter, definitely a hard chapter. And furthermore, the Productivity Commission pulls its punches. It pulls its punches because it goes outside of mainstream economic orthodoxy of the currently fashionable market economics. It goes closer to the old style Keynesian type economics, closer to that. But it's not that either. But I'm not going to explain all this now. That's in my paper. But so benefits are greater than costs. Benefits are 7 times greater than the economic benefits are 7 times greater than the economic costs. And the economic costs are 1/4 of the financial costs that you read about in the media. When the media says 6.5 billion, that is financial cost. Very hard to understand, but the economic cost is only 1/4 of that, because the other 3/4 is really just redistributing from taxpayer to support. So the economy as a whole does not lose, right? If there was no friction in the economy, then there would be no economic cost at all. In the same way that if you were to, as Galileo showed, if you were to roll a ball this way across the earth, and there was no friction, no mountains, no seas, no friction on the ground, it would have hit me in the bum. It would go around the world. Similarly, there would be no costs if there wasn't friction. Now, there is friction, right? But it does mean that the economic costs are substantially less, a quarter of the financial costs, right? And if we had a GST rather than an income tax, according to the Productivity Commission, the economic costs would only be 10% of the financial costs. So let me go through so to policy advisors, that's my message. To people with disability, my message is that you're probably in for disappointment. Okay? The financial costs are going to be greater, right? For a whole bunch of reasons, but I'll just give you three that I know of, okay? And it's because of the methodology of accounting and auditing. Accounting and auditing uses a methodology which takes data, existing data from the past. Now, the past is all based on a crooked system. And so if we are changing the system and hoping to change behaviour, the past is not relevant anymore. So to give you an example, the Productivity Commission assumes that the NDIS is going to support 2 taxi trips per fortnight. Now, my daughter uses something like 15 per fortnight. 2 taxi trips per fortnight gets you to the shopping centre, and then you've got a week to come back home. So that's one. I look at the support that my daughter gets at the moment, and based on that, the package that she will be getting, according to the Productivity Commission, is actually going to be less than what she currently is getting. So, hello, there's not going to be any much increase here. And thirdly, as far as children is concerned, they assume that the cost to children is going to be something, I forget whether it's a third of what it is for an adult. Now, again, the reason for that is because past behaviour, the parents have worn it all. And so it doesn't go into any balance sheets, doesn't go into any financial reports, so therefore it doesn't go to the Productivity Commission or to the audit or anyone else. And so it doesn't get counted. But that is the reality is, from my experience, is the cost for children, because there is so much transition as they grow in size, as they develop and go through different paths from home to preschool to primary school to high school to university, hopefully, the costs at each point of transition, there is a fixed cost. So I think the costs are underestimated. Okay, but let me go on. So that's my third message. Right. The Auditor General, I'm now going to my paper. The Auditor General basically made a comment about the Productivity Commission's report and said, yep, costs look fine, benefits look fine, and I think the benefits are fine, but they only looked at the costs. Costs look fine because it's all based on reasonable and necessary. But then, on one of the pages, it says there's a difference between reasonable and necessary and reasonable and appropriate. Now, earlier today, Michelle Crozier, I picked up that one of the words she used was appropriate. And I think that's what everyone's expecting in the NDIS. But the costs have all been based on necessary. Now, I don't know what the difference is. I think that it's something like 7 showers a week is appropriate, but only 3 or 4 are necessary. I don't know. And does anybody, and certainly the appropriate has not been costed. They have said that the necessary, which is what the legislation says. The legislation doesn't say reasonable or the rules or any of that. It doesn't say reasonable and appropriate. It says reasonable and necessary. But the Auditor General says, without defining the difference, that there's a difference between reasonable and appropriate. And I know that everybody here is expecting appropriate, and that's what bloody ought to happen, but it's unclear. So that's the first point that I want to make. Second point, Donna's already made, that it's a redistributive project and it's not about productivity and not about workforce participation. It is basically for supports for people to be able to get reasonable and necessary, be able to not clear what it's for. You know, there's lots of messages. Third point is, right, I've made that point. Now, here's the big thing. The difference between finance and economics. Finance is about individual entities, whether it be a company, a household, a government, a treasury. But it is not about the economy and well-being. It's only about profits and losses of the entity that is being looked at. Economics, on the other hand, is about society. It's a social science, if you like. It's about the nation, the region, the community, and its well-being. Finance is about profit and loss, surplus and deficit, budget surpluses, budget deficits. Economics is about efficiency and well-being. Well-being being very important because there's a difference between activity and well-being. Going back to the Keynesian economics, one of the things that Keynes said is that a government in periods of unemployment like the Depression, it would be a good thing to just hire people to dig holes and fill them up again. Because by paying them, that would create demand for shirt manufacturers and there'd be multiplier effects. Notice, it was activity only. Fill the hole and dig it up again. Got nothing to do with well-being. So there's a difference between well-being and activity. And when you read national economic, when you hear the unemployment statistics or the national accounts grew by 1% or whatever, that is an increase in activity, not necessarily in well-being. So for example, when there is an oil spill in the Atlantic or something like that, and all the cleaners come in to clean up the oil spill, hey, national activity's increased. Is well-being increased for either people or the fishermen or the fish? Okay, so it's not about well-being. And in fact, the United Nations, through the works of an economist, philosopher that I think everybody should know, his name is Amartya Sen. He's won the Nobel Prize in economics, critiquing economics and coming up with a philosopher lawyer called Martha Nussbaum with an approach which actually looks at well-being of individuals and people. And they're, interestingly enough, their focus of attention in one of the papers for Nussbaum, one of her major papers, and in a lot of Sen's work, is the focus of the person with the disability, right? That's where they look at the edge, not the average, right? And they look to create indicators of well-being as opposed to national accounts, etc. Now, why do we have this? The final difference between finance and economics is that finance, and why the media takes the finance accounting perspective, is that finance deals with tangible hard numbers, cash in, cash out. Yes, they have a few exceptions like accounting for depreciation and goodwill and a few things like that, but certainly not concepts of well-being either outside of the firm or the well-being of even people inside. Economics, on the other hand, deals with intangibles, things you can't necessarily see, which are hard to measure. And so if they're hard to measure, they don't have as much legitimacy. The concept that they use is utility. And they deal with guesstimates. And the economic model, the mainstream economic model, which says that price equals value, it works under very certain conditions. Mathematically, it's been shown, no problem. The assumptions, however, really do not apply to people with disability. But that's not what I'm here to today. So the first point that I want to make, the big point that you must understand that when you read the papers, you are reading finance. You are not reading economics. To read economics, you've got to read chapter 20 and understand it. Because what economics tells you, what the Productivity Commission tells you, is that the additional cost is only 1.56 billion, not 6.5 billion. Right? And it would be even less if it was a GST. So the economic cost is much less than the financial cost. But the media all talks about, and treasuries, because that's their brief. Right? That's what they're looking at. They've got to get deficits right. They've got to borrow money if they have deficits. And if you borrow money, you've got to pay people or raise taxes and stuff like that. The benefits side. The Productivity Commission basically calculates that eventually, in the long run, not immediately, only in the long run, the employment participation effect for people with disability is going to be $2.8 billion worth more output than currently exists, right? Because people are unemployed, so they will be doing stuff. And that'll be productive, and that's going to add 2.8 million, probably not by the year 2016 or 2020. It'll be more like 2040, okay? Similarly, the carer employment participation, so that, people who look after or are involved, parents. We're talking parents here, okay? They're going to be able to work, they'll be able to increase their output as well, and that'll be 1.5 billion. And what's my point here? The point is, though, they're both intangibles, right? They're trying to measure, they are estimating production which will happen, not based on financial statistics from the past. So they're guesstimates. They don't have the legitimacy. They're intangible, right? And then here's the big intangible. A big intangible is that they argue that there's a thing called what is the value of money? What's the value of $1? Well, the general assumption is that the value of $1 is $1. But economics has a law which is called the law of diminishing marginal utility, which basically says something along the lines of the first lick of the ice cream is really fabulous, the second one a little bit less so, third one a little bit less so. By the sixth one or the sixth cone, you'll probably throw up and it'll be negative. What does it mean? That the increase in well-being, desire, whatever, from the next unit will be less. So therefore, what does that imply? It means to very rich people, the value of, to very poor people, the value of what is $1 to average taxpayers is actually $3.6. Don't take my word for it. It's in the Productivity Commission. It's the part you didn't read or didn't understand. Right? It is unorthodox, it's generally not assumed, but any good economist in a good benefit cost analysis will take account of that, and the Productivity Commission has. But the newspapers, and it's an intangible, isn't it? It's not like cash, it's sort of trying to get at feelings. Well, it's trying to get what's inside the head. Very hard to measure. Intangible, so let's not talk about it. So as a result of that, and I don't know why the Productivity Commission, I do know why they didn't add it all up and say straight out that, okay, the total net benefit is 10.5 against a 1.56 cost. So hello, the benefit cost ratio is 6.71, which is pretty good. Because after all, the benefit cost ratio of the NBN is probably going to be less than 1. So this is going to be much more efficient in terms of citizen well-being than the NBN or the parental parent allowance going to $150,000. Okay, so the message that I haven't yet said to service providers, but it goes to everybody, is that it's all going to be very, very complex decision making, and we've heard this all morning. But what I've done here is, the way I've shown all this is I've put these concepts together, the various intangibles, and there's 5, they'll be on the next page, through a case study of Max and Ruth. And very simply, Max is a real case, and Max works in town, has a job, lives close to the city, goes to work by bus, comes home by taxi. Reason comes home by taxi is because at George Street in Wynyard, you basically have 8 buses with everyone scrambling on at the same time, and it's impossible to get on. However, the bus in the morning, he lives on an accessible bus route, and he lives very close to the bus station. So there's hardly anyone on the bus, and there's hardly anyone at the bus stop. So it's really easy to get on and go to town. So easy to go by bus, hard to come back. Now, I've done a bit of a whole case study, which I'm not going to go into, which shows all the complexities of and the ironies and the paradoxes. I love that sort of stuff. But the big one is that Ruth, and Ruth is fictitious, but Ruth lives half a kilometre close to the city. Lower transport costs, won't there be? Right, so lower transport costs. Yeah, no. Because by the time Ruth gets on the bus, there's lots of people on the bus stop is crowded, and it's just as hard for Ruth to get onto the bus without treading on people's toes with a wheelchair than it is for Max in the afternoon. So Ruth has to go by taxi both times, both in the morning and in the afternoon. So is the local area coordinator, assessor, going to say, right, and Max of course might lie and say, oh look, I want to go by taxi in the morning too, right? And Max could end up saying, well, and that would not be right, because there's a sense in which Max is doing quite fine catching a bus in the morning and coming back by taxi. But I think it's necessary to catch the taxi in the afternoon. So I hope that the NDIS will give him his morning taxi, morning bus, afternoon taxi, support for that. I hope that for the sake of the taxpayer, that Max does not get the morning taxi. But I think it would be absolutely essential for Ruth to get the morning taxi and the afternoon taxi, even though she lives closer, and intuitively, unless that local coordinator knows exactly what the situation is at Ruth's bus stop, Ruth definitely should get it, but probably won't. So one of the two, there's either going to be overspending or disappointment. You've got to have a lot of information to get it right. And that's going to be where the service providers come in. So, what are the 5 intangibles? I'm really running out of time, and I've lost sight of my stopwatch, and I think I forgot to put it on. I forgot to start it. How am I doing?
Oh, you're over.
Okay, very quickly. There are 5 intangibles. I've already mentioned one. The marginal utility of $1 to a taxpayer is actually $3.60, so the value of that redistribution is 3 times higher. Asymmetric information. The hiding of information affects all transactions. Too hard to explain now. Value and price, they're not the same. Value... Right, I've already mentioned how the economic cost is actually less than the budget cost. The economic cost is the budget cost minus the redistribution, and that's, and the rest is inefficiency, if you like. Then there's externalities. I do want to mention that. It's a very important concept, namely that other people get affected. Finance doesn't look at that. But the situation in my Max and Ruth case study is that actually there's a sense in which, from an individual point of view, Max ought not get the morning taxi, should only get the morning bus. But really, from a social point of view, from the viewpoint of the other commuters on the bus, because it takes longer and they're all going to be a little bit later to work, right, as a result of Max getting on the bus, and that means that they're not going to have as much leisure time, or they're not going to have as much income or something like that. Actually, from a social point of view, it's a paradox that the rest of society ought to demand that Max catch the taxi because Max is holding them up. So it's not from Max's point of view that he ought to get the taxi, but from the economic point of view. That's sort of an esoterica for this particular case study, but it's important when we're in talking about employment participation. And finally, there's this concept that the value of time is actually the amount of dollars not earned in employment. Okay, so, you know, that's an intangible which, again, accountants do not take into account, but which is a very important economic concept, that namely, you know, and that's why barristers probably don't play with their kids as much as plumbers, because when a barrister on $300 an hour plays with a kid for an hour, that's $300. When a plumber plays for an hour with the kids, that's only $70, right? So the barrister stays at work all the time. That's meant to be funny. Forget it. Okay. Look, these are the NDIS, not important. It's in my paper. This is not important. Oh, insights of mainstream economics, market imperfections. Mainstream good economics is not market economics. It does not say that the market is always right. And that's the Keynesian type notion, right? And these are the conditions, they're the 4 conditions. I go through it in paper, not important. But what is important to understand here is that just because the market gets it wrong sometimes doesn't mean that it's automatically ought to be a government thing, because governments also make mistakes. There are also government imperfections, okay? That's probably not really important. I'm still playing the Cold War here. Okay, why we need a Donna's told you all about that. Like, finally, you can request a final copy of my paper by going onto the website www.disabex.com, and at the moment it's still in draft form because for all sorts of reasons, but when it's finally paper, it's not easy going, but I will answer questions and about it, and I am in retirement, just out of passion, sort of trying to develop an economics of disability, which I hope that one PhD student somewhere will take up and do what I'm too old to do now.
Thank you. I never knew that chapter of the Productivity Commission could be so interesting. But thank you very much, and there'll be ample opportunity to ask questions. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our third speaker in this section about finance and economics, and that is Nerissa Wilson. And I saw Nerissa at lunchtime. She reminded me that we had